Okay, so welcome everybody. My name is Jerry. I'm going to take you through the building. So, Jim, welcome. So, tonight's presentation is going to be on Zachariah Chandler, and for the tour guide service, our basic knowledge of Zachariah Chandler just comes from the fact we just have a very large portrait of him outside the Senate gallery. And for the most part, other than just knowing his name and that he was a U.S. Senator during the Civil War, we don't really have to talk about him. Because, the Senate gallery is our last stop, and we're usually on a tight time frame, especially when we have our school groups. And once in a great while, though, we'll get a request from one of the state senators. They want to meet with their school group outside the Senate gallery, get a quick picture with them. And as you're gathering up your students, you can't quite help but miss Zachariah Chandler. So he's hovering above you. Hi, folks. Kind of glaring at you, not directly at you, but more like just past you, like he's contemplating some serious issue. And the students can't help but notice him. And years ago, one of our former tour guides shared with me how he approached Zachariah Chandler to the school students. As they're looking up to him, he'll say to them, "Looks angry, doesn't he?" And the students will nod and say, "Yeah." You know what he's angry about? And they'll shake their heads, no. Slavery. Zachariah Chandler was an abolitionist, and there was 4 million people in the United States living in bondage at this time, men, women, and children, and he felt that this was wrong. We were a republic, and a republic is a Latin word. It literally means matters of the people. So a republic is a government for the people, and he felt it should be for all the people. Okay, so in addition to that, if you consider the fact this is the time before women were allowed to vote, there were still about 250,000 African Americans living in the United States at that time that could not participate in government. Okay, they couldn't vote. Okay, they couldn't hold political office. They couldn't serve in the military. They couldn't even serve on juries. And Zachariah Chandler felt that this too was also wrong, because our Constitution said we're going to be a government made up of the people, not some aristocratic class. So he felt that this should be all the people that should be allowed to participate in government. So you could see just for these two reasons alone why Zachariah Chandler was given an honored place in our state capitol with a portrait. Eventually, he was given a statue in Washington, D.C. in Statuary Hall. It stayed there for 100 and, I don't even think it made 100 years. I'll have to check my numbers, but close to 100 years he stayed there. Okay, now, say to understand the personality and character of Zachariah Chandler, I think we should start with a little family history. It was first published in his biography of 1880, which was published a year after he died. So imagine a 3-year-old chasing a goose around the yard twice his size because it just attacked his 5-year-old brother. Okay, this was Zachariah Chandler. Okay, this would be the person that would grow up to help lead to preserve the Union, bring an end to slavery, expand universal suffrage, and even bring civil rights. Zachariah Chandler, he was born in a small provincial town of Bedford, New Hampshire. He was born one out of 7 children. And they had a family farm. His father owned the merchant store in town. He had 2 grandfathers that actually fought in the American Revolution. Okay? And his father was a judge. He had 2 uncles that served in both their state legislatures and in Congress. So you could see he was actually raised with a strong kinship of the foundation of our country. The interpretation of what that country meant, its laws, as well as a strong participation in it. Okay, Zachariah Chandler, he was educated in the traditional New England public school system, okay, public school system that Michigan would adopt when we became a state. In his teen years, he went to Pinkerton Academy about 10 miles away, where he did his secondary education. After the completion of this, he became a school teacher. Okay, but a year later, one of his brothers went off to college. So Zachariah Chandler stepped in to the family store and he managed that for a while. And that is where he found his calling. Okay, and I don't know if it was his idea or his sister's or his brother's, but or his brother-in-law, I should say. They came up with the idea they're going to go out west and make it rich, make a fortune as merchants. Okay, and so with $1,000 loan, west was the territory of Michigan, So welcome to Detroit, 1833. Now, setting yourself up as a merchant in Detroit of 1833, this was the best of times, and it was the worst of times. Okay, it was the best of times because settlers were coming to the Michigan territory in droves. I mean, it was getting to the point where they're averaging about 100 settlers a day were arriving. And I want to say the population at the time in Detroit was around about 2,000 people when Zachariah Chandler arrived. 20 years later, by the 1850 census, they had over 20,000 people live in Detroit. Okay, now the territory of Michigan, which was about 13,000 people, by 1850, 20 years later, it had risen to over 400,000 people, and they all needed merchants. Okay, now it was the worst of time too, because that first winter of 1833, 1834 was the first year of cholera that arrived to the United States. Okay, and cholera is like dysentery. Okay, and they believe that it came from India with the British soldiers when they were being retransferred into Canada. And from there, it just quickly spread to New York and Michigan. And there was a lot of high casualty rates that first year. Am I walking out of frame? Okay. All right. So anyways, so Zachariah Chandler, they didn't make much money that first year. And he himself found himself volunteering a lot at the local hospital, taking care of the sick. And because they weren't making much money that year, Zachariah Chandler's brother-in-law decided to just sell his shares of the merchant store. And he was just going to leave Zachariah Chandler on his own to make his fortune. Okay. And boy, did he. Okay, can I switch it? Boop. Did it work? Okay. I'm sorry. Okay, I'm in frame now. Okay, so and boy did he. Okay, because remember what I said, this is the best of times. Settlers are coming in droves. So he quickly established himself as the top merchant in Detroit. And then he expanded to like blacksmith shops, wheelwrights. He got into shipping, real estate. Then he wanted to go ahead and expand other merchant stores. And so he entered a whole bunch of partnerships all across southern Michigan. And when the wholesalers couldn't keep up with his demand, he just decided to go into the wholesale business himself. And so you can imagine he's traveling all over southern Michigan. Then he has to head back east to New York City, make sure he gets all of his goods and supplies to have it all sent back to Detroit. So this is one thing I also want you to understand about Zachariah Chandler, his personality, his character. He was very extroverted. He liked being around people. He was very comfortable with people. He could be just as natural and comfortable with a family staying at their farm somewhere in Michigan as he was back east having some very elegant dinner with a bunch of New York socialites. Okay, he was never really pretentious with other people, nor did he ever like have this inferiority complex. Okay, all right. So one of his many trips back out east, he convinced this shoemaker from New Jersey that was about his age to come to Michigan, make his fortune. And he did. His name was Henry P. Baldwin, and he became a very close friend and confidant through the rest of Zachariah Chandler's life. He's important to us because he became our 15th governor, and he's the one that called for and signed into legislation the construction of our beautiful third Capitol building here. Okay, now, so by 1845, let me take a quick drink here. 1845, Zachariah Chandler was not only considered one of the richest people in Michigan, he was considered one of the richest men in the old Northwest. And it is a truth, the university acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. Okay, and here she is. Letitia Grace Douglas. She came from a very wealthy business family from New York City, Maryland. She added a lot to Zachariah Chandler's social status. She was considered the best hostess in Detroit. And when Zachariah Chandler became a U.S. Senator, she was considered the best hostess in Washington, D.C. And she was also a close confidant to him, because I was kind of surprised as I was reading about it. He did send her a lot of letters during the time of the Civil War. And he was sharing with her things that he wasn't sharing in public. Okay, and trust me when I say there was not much that Zachariah Chandler would not share in public. Okay, he was an open book. If something he didn't like, he let everybody know about it. Okay, together they would have one child, Mary Douglas Chandler, and Zachariah Chandler, he adored her. He called her Minnie, and she kept that name for the rest of her life with family and friends. Fortunately, I do not have a portrait of her. I did find an article about the time she passed away in 1930, and even the newspaper article said there is not a known portrait of her. Okay, and why this is, I'm not really sure. I can kind of speculate. I'll do that a little bit later in the presentation. Okay, she would go on, marry a young congressman, and he would eventually become a US senator himself. In fact, when she died in 1930, she was only one out of three women in American history that was a daughter, a wife, and a mother of a United States senator. Hey, now, Zachariah Chandler himself, he entered politics at the age of 36 when he was elected mayor of Detroit in 1850. Okay, now this is a one-year non-paid position. Okay, and he won campaigning that the city of Detroit's going to invest heavily in its infrastructure. Because remember what I said, Detroit's population had grown to over 20,000 people at this point. Okay, well, the infrastructure had not been keeping up. So a lot of money had to be spent in its waterworks, its streets, its sanitation. Okay. So remember also too that I said Zachariah Chandler had two uncles that served in their state legislature and in Congress. Okay. Well, they were Democrats. Okay, and he himself, he went to the opposite party at that time called the Whigs. Okay, now when I start saying Democrats and eventually Republicans here, I want you to understand I'm talking about in the historical sense. Okay, I'm not talking about today's parties because we're talking, there's almost 200-year gulf between them. Okay, they had different issues they were dealing with, they had different platforms, whatnot. So now the reason why Zachariah Chandler would join the Whig Party, a couple things. Number one, I had to do the Wildcat Bank in the 1830s. Okay, President Andrew Jackson, he was a Democrat. He went to war with the Bank of the United States. He felt that the United States government should not be involved banking. That should be private industry. And he felt states, not the federal government, should do the regulating. Okay, when I said regulated, I'm talking about all the banks are required to have a third of their coinage, their specie on hand for the money that they're printing. Some states were better at this than others, and Michigan was not one of them. So people like Zachariah Chandler and others, they would lose quite a bit of their fortune during this age of wildcat banking, where banks would just show up and then they would just close down and just leave with everybody's money. Okay, now another reason why Zachariah Chandler would join the Whig Party had to do with his strong anti-slavery sentiment. And the people of Detroit and Michigan found out that he was an abolitionist in that year of 1847, 1848, because that's when the Crosswhite Affair in Marshall, Michigan happened. Okay, this was a runaway slave family that settled in Marshall, Michigan. Kentucky slave owners came up, they're going to surround the house and they're going to go ahead and capture the family and take them back to Kentucky. Now, the town folks of Marshall heard what was happening, so they all came and started obstructing the Kentucky slaveholders from doing what they came to do. The sheriff of Calhoun County showed up and he arrested the slave hunters for disturbing the peace. Okay, and while they're being detained, the leading townspeople helped the Crosswhite family escape through the Underground Railroad through Detroit into Canada. Okay, now the leading townspeople then were sued by the slave owners for liable for the cost of their slaves. And so that trial was held in Detroit the following year. And the Zachariah Chandler, that's when he showed up and he paid for their defense. Okay, and then when the verdict came down that they were guilty of being liable for the loss of the slaves and they owed the slave holders $6,000, Zachariah Chandler stepped up and he paid that as well. Okay, so now I should say, now both the Democrat Party and the Whig parties did have anti-slave sentiment, but the Democrat National Party platform at this time was now in favor of expanding slavery, whereas the Whig Party at that time was still trying to restrict it to the Deep South. Okay, so that's why he was joining the Whig Party. So with Zachariah Chandler being elected mayor, he became face of the Whig Party in the state of Michigan. Okay, which had always been the minority party to a solid Democrat, Michigan. You can see here, this is actually an amazing picture that we found. It has both Zachariah Chandler, he's in the bottom right corner here. Okay, his hair is actually light. And he's just leaning back and he's staring to the left center of the face of the Democrat Party in Michigan at this time, General Lewis Cass. Okay, now, General Lewis Cass had been the face of the Democrat Party for years. He was a general in the War of 1812. He was our territory governor for 20 years. He was Secretary of War under President Andrew Jackson. And then he became minister to France. And then after that, he came back to Michigan and he had been the US Senator for Michigan for many years. Okay, now the issue that they're dealing here, if you look down the center, I know I'm stepping on my frame here. Okay, if you look down to the center, we had two African American, and this is the big issue in the nation. Okay, and not only in the nation, but in Michigan too, because at this same time in 1850, 1851, there's the issue, should we allow African Americans to vote? Okay, and the whole vote went up to the people, and they voted it down. They were not going to allow it. Okay, so with Zachariah Chandler's popularity at this time in the Whig Party, he was just going to ride this momentum to the office of governor of the state of Michigan. And Lewis Cass did everything he could to keep this from happening. He did not want to lose Michigan to the Whigs. And he was quite successful of it because he was able to get reelected the incumbent Democrat governor, Robert McClellan. Okay, and so after this election, Zachariah Chandler told a friend, I do believe the general owes me his U.S. Senate seat. Okay. All right. Okay, I want everybody to open up their high school textbooks to the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. Okay, this is going to be on our test at the end, okay? So really break it down real quick. A U.S. Senator from Illinois wanted to build a railroad from his home city of Chicago out to San Francisco. This is going to cost a lot of money. So in order to convince the usually tight-fisted Southern politicians to help pay for this, he proposed probably about the biggest compromise you could ever. All this time, we had a boundary line underneath Missouri. This is where I'm walking out of frame here, May. So underneath this line, slavery could not exist, okay? He did away with this line with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, opening it up for slavery, not just to come in as states, but allow the residents of those territories to go ahead and vote if they want to be slave or not. So all of a sudden you have in Kansas, you have pro-slavery people showing up from the South, then you have the anti-slavery people showing up from the North, and they began to fight. Okay, this is called Bleeding Kansas. Zachariah Chandler himself, he gave personally $10,000 for the anti-slavery cause in Kansas. Okay, so the Kansas-Nebraska Act was actually a catalyst for both political parties at the time. Okay, the Democrats had already split up into the Free Soil Party. Okay, the Whigs at this time just all of a sudden on their national platform decided they're not even going to have an issue about slavery anymore. They just wouldn't mention it at all. Zachariah Chandler left the Whig Party. And newspapers were calling across the country that we should have a fusion party of all these anti-slavery disaffected members of both parties. And this is where Zachariah Chandler actually stepped up. He started traveling and meeting with these disaffected party members from Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, back into Michigan. He went to Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, and he was putting together a coalition that we would form a new party. Okay, and he organized the very first party meeting for a state in Jackson, Michigan. Okay, and as they arrived, there was just so many people showing up for this this convention that the hall that they rented was just way too small, so they had to take it outside, and they went underneath the oak trees, and that's why this is always called Underneath the Oaks, the birthplace of the Republican Party. That's where they selected the name themselves, and all the other state conventions then adopted the Republican Party name after that. Now, you would think that somebody who just ran for governor and pretty much helped establish his own party, he would put himself on the top of the state's party ticket for that year, for that election. But he didn't. Instead, he personally nominated the only congressman from Michigan that voted no for the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and that was Kinsley S. Bingham. He became our first Republican governor elected in 1854. So Zachariah Chandler's role actually was he was going to be the chairman of the Republican Party. Yeah, he was going to go help campaigns to get all the Republicans elected in just about every election that they can. So not only did we have the governor's office, but he was also made sure he secured the Secretary of State's office for the Republican Party, the State Attorney General's office. And once they secured the majority of the Michigan House of Representatives and Michigan Senate, his reward was General Lewis Cass' U.S. Senate seat, because this is the days when the state legislature elected who those U.S. senators would be in Washington, D.C. So with that, when Lewis Cass left the U.S. Senate, an end of the Great Compromise era ended. Okay, Lewis Cass was the last one. For 3 generations, these men did everything they could to compromise to keep the Union from fragmenting. but at the cost of expanding and protecting slavery. And that's what led to men like Zachariah Chandler when they arrived. And you can see here, this is one of Zachariah Chandler's very first speech he gave in the Senate. It says, "The old women of the North who have been in the habit of crying out the Union is danger have passed off the stage. They are dead. But in their stead, we have a race of men who are devoted to this Union and devoted to it as Jefferson and the fathers made it and bequeathed it to us." Okay, so imagine yourself now in the Senate. Both sides of the aisle's eyebrows are raised at this senator from Michigan. Okay, on one side, you got the backs that are stiffening from outrage at what he's saying. And then the other side, the backs are actually starting to straighten. They're finding this new courage. And that's one of the consensus I did when I was doing my research about Zachariah Chandler. Everybody that served with him, they always said that Zachariah Chandler they looked to as their strength. Abraham Lincoln shared that during the darkest days of the rebellion, he leaned more on Mr. Chandler than anybody else for courage. Right? Now, he made quite an impression in his first year. Second year, there was an explosion at his house. It was terrible. It was a new house he built on 4th Street, and there was a leak somewhere from the pipes. And as he was walking around trying to find out where that leak was, he was being followed by one of his workers at that time. And when he walked into the closet, his worker came in with a candle right behind him, and the room just exploded, and it just hit Zachariah Chandler full force right in the face. His little daughter, Meanie, who was 7 years old at the time, was right underneath him as she was following him. He fell on top of her to protect her from the rest of the explosion, but she did get burned in this explosion as well, which is why I kind of suggest maybe she had some scarring at that time, and she might have been a little bit sensitive about having her photograph taken. Okay, Zachariah Chandler, he definitely got the worst. All his hair was burned off. He had to have surgery done to his mouth to repair it. He had to spend a whole year recovering with bandages over his face. And once the bandages were off and he was healed, they said the scarring gave him this new appearance of this fearsome expression. Almost a permanent scowl was on his face, especially when he was giving a speech of some particular topic he was very passionate about. Okay, and that such type of speech occurred almost immediately once he returned back to the U.S. Senate in 1859. John Brown raid, Harper's Ferry. Okay, John Brown, he was one of those Kansas fighters. He was going to lead a slave revolt starting in Virginia and just working all the way through the South, freeing all the slaves on his own. It began and ended at Harper's Ferry, now West Virginia. He was captured by Lieutenant Colonel Robert E. Lee and a bunch of Marines. Within 6 weeks, he and the surviving men there, they were tried for treason and hung. So in the U.S. Senate, what was happening now at this time was resolutions were being passed on both sides condemning the action. Of course, one northern senator did try to make out John Brown as a misguided martyr who was just fighting for freedom. Okay, a lot of the Southerners were calling for committee meetings to do further investigations and find out if there was more revolts that were being organized. Now, when Zachariah Chandler took the floor, he was quite blunt, right to the point. He said, "So it's hanging for treason, is it? I want every member in the Senate to know it's now on the record that come they from the north, south, east, or west, dare you to raise your impious hands against this government, against our Constitution and our laws, and you'll be hanged." And for emphasis, he was staring directly at those Southern senators, because now what was happening was they're openly discussing seceding from the Union. And that's exactly what happened. In 1860 was the election of Abraham Lincoln. For the first time, the Republicans won the majority of the House, and one by one, the Southern states just began succeeding. So now all of a sudden, you got 100 John Browns seizing federal arsenals, their shipyards, custom houses, post office. So Abraham Lincoln, he raised 75,000 soldiers to put down this rebellion, and Michigan certainly did its part. There you go. Michigan certainly did its part. We had, eventually through the course of the Civil War, we had about 90,000 soldiers that were raised to fight in this war. Over 10,000 gave up their lives. Zachariah Chandler, he was a big part of this, raising soldiers. He even offered to raise the very first colored regiment. because he wrote a letter to the Secretary of War at the time that he personally knew men in Canada that wanted to come and fight for their freedom. This would not be allowed, not until after Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. So I think January 1st, 1863, that's when they first were allowed to serve as colored soldiers. Now, Zachariah Chandler actually wrote a letter that was leading up to the conflict to the governor at the time, our Civil War governor, Governor Austin Blair, and he was just describing the situation that was happening in Washington. At the very end of it, he wrote a postscriptum that said, some of the manufacturing states think that a fight would be awful. Without a little bloodshed in the Union, or excuse me, without a little bloodletting, this Union will not, in my estimation, be worth the rush. Okay, now, this letter inspired Governor Austin Blair. He had it printed and sent to every member in the state legislature. Okay, of course, you can imagine within 24 hours, newspapers were running with this letter too, especially in the South. And especially the opposite party at the time, the Democrats, they were throwing this letter back in Zachariah Chandler's face, saying, you're the reason why we had this Civil War. You were calling for blood. Okay, and for years, Zachariah Chandler had to defend himself with this letter, basically saying, what I meant to say was that this country was worth fighting for, and I still stand by this letter. Okay, so sometimes you can see Zachariah Chandler, his word choice was just didn't really do him any favors sometimes. All right, now Zachariah Chandler did a lot of things for the good of the war that had an effect, but probably the biggest one he had was creating the Committee on the Conduct of the War. Okay, beginning of the war was not going very well for the Union, and Zachariah Chandler and other members of Congress, they want to know why. Okay, was it poor equipment, poor training, not enough troops? Okay, was it incompetence in our leadership? Okay, was it treason? And they wanted to find this out why. So at the time, and even over the years, historians always criticized this committee. They said this was a big overreach by Congress. They were just meddling and interfering with the army trying to conduct the war, and especially when it came to generals in the East. And some even called it that was being used as a political tool that was just going after Democrat generals, like one certain General George B. McClellan, who actually had a letter that was printed in the newspapers at the time that said before he would move into Virginia, President Lincoln needed to write a proclamation saying the Union Army was going to protect slavery. Okay, now Lincoln, on the other hand, he was actually favorable for this committee because, like them, he wanted to know why the war was not going, what they could do that was better. And he really appreciated having the backing of Congress when he wanted to get rid of some certain generals that he found to be a bit too timid and too insubordinate. Because here's the story. Zachariah Chandler actually went to George McClellan's house to meet with him. He'd been waiting an hour. When the general finally showed up, he just went straight up to bed. Okay. So now, in contradiction to the criticism of this committee, they were very favorable with what was happening out west. You know, the victory after victory, and they wanted to promote these generals to be in charge of the war. Okay, and some of them were even Democrats. The one particular general they wanted to promote was General Ulysses S. Grant. In fact, the committee wanted him to be in charge of the army so bad they convinced Congress to give him 3 stars. Okay, the very first 3-star general we had since George Washington. And it's kind of funny that Zachariah Chandler was on this committee and he wanted to get General Ulysses S. Grant promoted. 14 years before that, in Detroit, a young Lieutenant Grant slipped on the ice in front of Zachariah Chandler's house and he sued him for not keeping his sidewalks clear of snow. Zachariah Chandler defended himself in this trial and he said, I shouldn't have to be responsible for every drunken soldier that walks past my house. And he lost, and he was ordered to pay Lieutenant Grant 6 cents to cover the cost of his medical expenses. Now, here they are, 14 years later, the country's in peril, and Zachariah Chandler's turning to him and saying he needs to be in charge. From that point on, those two were like the closest of friends, and they had a very strong working relationship for years after that. Okay, now one of the other things the committee did, they investigated atrocities committed both by the Union and the Confederates. One of the worst atrocities was definitely Andersonville Prison. Okay, this is the Confederate prison that held the Union prisoners. Conditions were so bad that it was close to 30% of the soldiers died there. Okay, compare this to about 10 to 12% in the Union prisons. Okay, now I have to warn you about this next slide. It may be a little bit disturbing. Malnourished soldiers that were coming back were in such poor conditions. Zachariah Chandler ordered that photographs be taken of all of them because he never wanted the public to ever forget what was done to these Union soldiers. He wrote to his wife at that time that at the conclusion of the war, there's really only two people that he wanted to see hang. Okay, the Confederate President Jefferson Davis and the commander of Andersonville Prison. Okay, he only got his wish for one of them because the commander was tried in military court and he was found guilty of murder. Now, by 1864, it was pretty much a foregone conclusion that the Union was going to win the war. So work had to be begun on how we would bring the states back together. And this is going to be called Reconstruction. One bill that passed through Congress was the Wade-Davis bill. And once that passed both houses, it was sent to Lincoln, and Lincoln was very hesitant about signing it. So Zachariah Chandler was sent over to convince the president to go ahead and sign it. And the president said he had some issues with part of the bill that said that the states that come back in the Union, they had to abolish slavery. And he felt that Congress could not put that stipulation on them, that the U.S. Supreme Court would not allow that to be constitutional. And Zachariah Chandler said, well, it's no less than what you did during the war. And he said, yes, but I did this as a war effort. And that was my powers as president. And even then, once the war is over, I'm not sure how the Supreme Court will still view that. So Zachariah Chandler told him that he was very disappointed in the president, but he said he was going to work with him and he's going to work with Congress so they would come up with something that they would call Supreme Court proof. And that was going to be the 13th Amendment. Right? Now, the fallout of President Grant doing this was that members of the Republican Party, those radicals that wanted to abolish slavery, were very unhappy with him. So they ended up nominating John C. Fremont to run for that office, presidential election of 1864. And so this was going to split the Republican vote. Okay, and the problem with that was the Democrats, they nominated, Abraham Lincoln's favorite person here, George B. McClellan, and he was campaigning that only he can win this war and only he can bring the Union back together. So once again, Zachariah Chandler was sent off and he met with supporters of John C. Fremont and John C. Fremont himself, and he convinced them to step down for the good of the country, okay, which he actually did. And at that point, Zachariah Chandler, he took over the campaign for President Lincoln because he'd been the chairman of the Michigan Republican Party. So he did all the campaigning for Abraham Lincoln, and Lincoln would win that November in a landslide. Okay, and to show how much Abraham Lincoln did recognize who he owed his election to, that night when he walked in with the inaugural ball, he had Mrs. Zachariah Chandler on his arm, and they were followed by Senator Chandler and First Lady Mary Todd Lincoln on his arm as well. Okay, of course, President Lincoln, he didn't survive but a month into his second term. Okay, assassinated 2 days after the war was declared over. Vice President Andrew Johnson was then going to have to lead the nation through Reconstruction. Okay, and this is where Zachariah Chandler admits that he made one of his biggest miscalculations in his life. He actually thought President Andrew Johnson was going to be a better president than Abraham Lincoln. Okay, he was very zealous in prosecuting the war. But what he didn't realize that Andrew Johnson, he was very anti-civil rights. He didn't believe that the blacks should have suffrage. They should not be voting. The South just started descending into chaos. Atrocities, violence was committed against the freed African Americans. Congress was trying to establish the freedmen bureaus that would help transition 4 million slaves into civilian society. He was trying to undermine all of that as he could. And eventually Congress would impeach him on 11 counts, which pretty much fall under just trying to obstruct Congress's role. And Zachariah Chandler's only role in this impeachment was that he just showed up to the trial every day and he ended up voting guilty. But President Andrew Johnson escaped conviction by 1 vote. Right. Which no matter because it was an 1868 election year and they're going to their next George Washington, Ulysses S. Grant, and he was running as Republican, and Grant actually worked with Congress to get Reconstruction through. Okay, it was a very good relationship they had. So by the end of Grant's term, we can look at here what they did. All the states entered the Union, meaning they all had representation in the U.S. House, the U.S. Senate. Okay, they had to come in though with the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery. They had to come in with the 14th Amendment that says if you were born in the United States, you were automatically a citizen. This was important because it removed that U.S. Supreme Court decision, the Dred Scott decision, that said that, well, if you're African American, you cannot be a citizen of the United States. Okay, the 15th Amendment, they guaranteed the right to vote regardless of race, color, or servitude. Okay, and now it's very interesting because they left off gender. They didn't say male, they left it off. And this was a huge momentum for the women's suffrage movement with that. They kept pointing to the 15th Amendment, and that would lead them to trying to vote, to trying to run for office. Crazy, I know. So anyways, the Freedmen Bureau was established under Lincoln and to help transition African Americans into civilian society. Department of Justice had to be created because so many atrocities that I mentioned were being committed in the South too. Also, what never really gets mentioned about, but through Reconstruction, this is where Congress required all states to require to have public schools. And that was a very important part coming out of Reconstruction. And by 1872, they passed with a 2/3 majority in the Congress to go ahead and remove the disqualification that if you were part of an insurrection that had previously sworn an oath to the United States, they removed that disqualification that you couldn't hold political office, federal, state, local. Okay, so you can see as far as Zachariah Chandler was concerned, they accomplished every mission. Now what they had to do was just live with each other. One of the most elusive things that they had to do, and I say elusive because it took a long time, was come up with the Civil Rights Act, all the laws to be passed. And this was a bill that was by Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, and he was dying in 1874. And while he was dying, he was bringing in members of Congress like Zachariah Chandler. He was pleading with them, please don't let my bill die with me. And Zachariah Chandler promised that he would help get this bill passed. And that's exactly what they did a year later. So it was passed by Congress, signed into law by President Grant, Civil Rights Act of 1875, that from that point on, discrimination and what's the word? I'm thinking discrimination would not be allowed. Segregation, that's the word, I'm sorry. Segregation, discrimination and segregation was outlawed in the United States. And this would last for 8 years until 1883, when the United States Supreme Court ruled this unconstitutional. And from that point on, it'd be another 81 years before we get the next Civil Rights Act of 1964. And what happened was the United States was divided up into apartheid states. Jim Crow laws were now established, which actually ended up putting African Americans severely handicapped politically, severely handicapped economically. Zachariah Chandler himself, he actually did not live to see that happen. He died in 1879, 4 years before the U.S. Supreme Court decision. So that basically covered Zachariah Chandler's role for the fight for freedom, universal suffrage. A few other things he did. You have to understand he was chairman of the Committee on Commerce. And like when he was mayor of Detroit, he was very big on infrastructure for the country. And he was also very big for the Great Lakes. Shipping had become so big with these large ships and all their cargo that they couldn't get through this St. Clair Flats anymore. They had a portage across from St. Clair Lake St. Clair up into Port Huron. And Zachariah Chandler, he went ahead through his committee, and they had this huge infrastructure go ahead and dredge the St. Clair Flats. Same thing up in the Keweenaw Peninsula. They wanted a quicker route through the Keweenaw, so they created a canal through the portage. So Zachariah Chandler created the largest island in Lake Superior. Okay. Another thing you have to understand, with all this extra shipping going on, you need lighthouses to safely guide them. So if anybody ever visited any of these lighthouses here, like in Grand Haven, South Haven, you actually saw a Zachariah Chandler lighthouse. Okay, now in 1867, the United States purchased from Russia, Alaska. And what was brought to the committee was the fur seal hunting situation. The fur seals had been hunted so much, they're close to extinction. So Zachariah Chandler, they created a reservation for 2 islands to help protect the fur seals. So yeah, so when you hear Zachariah Chandler's name, I want you to think of baby seals, right? Okay, now you have to understand the Republican Party was born as twins. Okay, but we're talking about in the biblical sense of Jacob and Esau, fighting for their inheritance rights to lead. And after the Civil War was over and Reconstruction was done, the Republican Party began to disagree amongst themselves. And eventually in 1875, a coalition was put with enough dissatisfied Republicans and Democrats that they actually voted somebody else to Zachariah Chandler's U.S. Senate seat. So just like that, Zachariah Chandler was gone in 1875. But that only lasted for about 7 months because President Ulysses S. Grant at the time, he was dealing with a lot of scandals in his administration. So he appointed Zachariah Chandler to take over the Department of Interior to clean it up. And Zachariah Chandler, he began this very extensive audit that would lead to a giant, huge, exhaustive report he gave to Congress, even personally testifying in Congress, where he showed where all the money was being spent, he showed where all the abuses, and then he had his huge list of people that he wanted criminally referred to. He only served 14 months, but for decades, he was always considered one of the best Secretary of Interiors that the nation ever had. And meanwhile, what he was doing with all of that, he was still the chairman of the Republican Party. And he got a lot of credit for being the hero that saved the election of 1876 for Republican candidate Rutherford B. Hayes. And he also got a lot of accusation as being the villain that stole the election from Democrat candidate Samuel J. Tilden. I thought, actually, when I was going to do this presentation, I thought this was going to be a big part of my presentation, because there's just so many interesting facts about Zachariah Chandler and this election and everything, but it's just too long. I have to go on. So let's go back to the inauguration of our Capitol building. First opened up in January 1879. One of the very first businesses they had to do is they needed to find a new U.S. senator, because the one they had replaced Zachariah Chandler, he ended up taking a position as minister to Peru. And it was really no contest, because that state legislator unanimously voted Zachariah Chandler to go ahead and take back his Senate seat. And when Zachariah Chandler went up to the House of Representatives rostrum, in true Chandler fashion, he gave his speech saying that, yeah, he's made mistakes, but there was not one vote, not one speech that he wouldn't repeat under the same circumstance. So with Zachariah Chandler being sent back to the U.S. Senate, like a new curtain opened up on his political career. And this was in the sense that he was probably more popular than ever. And that had a lot to do, too, with his Jeff Davis speech that he gave. What it was is a bill about Jefferson Davis that, well, the Mexican-American War soldiers that served, well, if they're Confederate, they weren't supposed to get pension. Congress was voting that they could get their pension, even though they were in the rebellion, except Jefferson Davis. That was the bill being taken up. And a lot of the Southern senators at the time were standing up and they're praising Jefferson Davis. They're arguing for him. Says eulogies. He was still alive, though, at this point, saying he was about the noblest of the noble Southern men, fighting for the good cause. And when Zachariah Chandler got his chance to speak, he just let them have it. Okay. He went into very descriptive detail what it was like when he arrived after a battle. He described piles of the amputated arms, the legs. He described what it was like to go back home and talk to the mothers, the wives, the daughters, why their soldier wasn't coming home and grieving with them. And he said, concerning the fact that Jefferson Davis, he swore an oath to protect the Constitution when he was Secretary of War. And then he took an oath when he was a United States Senator. They both took the oath. They were standing together on the Senate floor when they both took the oath to protect the Constitution. Considering that fact, he wasn't just a traitor, he was a double-dyed traitor. When Zachariah Chandler then sat down at that point, the whole gallery of the Senate just broke out in applause. And that speech was printed in newspapers across the country. And you can imagine, it was praised and criticized. For days, Zachariah Chandler was seeing 100 letters a day from Civil War veterans and their families thanking him for putting the Civil War back into its proper perspective and sharing with them that what cost that was given to protect the Union. Zachariah Chandler was so popular at this point that his name actually was being openly speaking as being the next candidate for the presidential election of 1880. Okay. We never got the chance to see if that was going to happen, because on October 31st of 1879, Zachariah Chandler gave his last speech. He went to bed that night complaining of chest pains and wondering if he smoked too much. That morning on November 1st, he was found dead in his hotel bedroom. A very large entourage from Michigan came with former state legislators and with current state legislators. They are led by Zachariah Chandler's longtime friend, Henry P. Baldwin. And he took the body back to Detroit, which was laid into state. On the day of his funeral, President Rutherford B. Hayes ordered all federal offices to be closed, all flags half-mast. And in the largest funeral that the city of Detroit had ever seen, and probably till this day had ever seen, he was carried to Elmwood Cemetery and laid to rest. President Grant, he wrote to the nation. He said, not only did Michigan lose its greatest statement, but so too did the nation, because in all of his years, he always considered Zachariah Chandler as one of the best. Okay, so I guess what I want you to take away from Zachariah Chandler, probably what he would like you to take away from his career in life, is that he believed the Constitution gave us the greatest government in the world. But it was a Constitution that had to live up to that other document that Zachariah Chandler revered, the Declaration of Independence, that all men were created equal. And he felt that not only were we supposed to be a government that was going to be for all the people, he also felt that the government had to be made up of all the people. And just as important, considering the fact where the power is going to come, it has to come by the people, which is literally the definition of what a democracy is supposed to be, a government by the people. He felt that it should be all the people that should be allowed to have that power. Okay, and that is the end of my presentation of Zachariah Chandler. Thank you. And I'm here to answer any questions. Oh, yeah.
East Lansing, there's a Chandler Road, is that?
Yes, yes, and that's why I was talking with David. I was on a podcast about that with Chandler Road. Chandler in 1855, so this is before he became a U.S. Senator, the Michigan Agriculture College was established, and people could buy the lands, swamp lands from them. And he bought that huge swamp land that became known as Zachariah Chandler Swamp. And where Abbott Road and Chandler Road meet, that is the southern boundary line of his farm. Okay, and I could go into long detail. We talked about it for over half an hour on Zachariah Chandler Farm. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. So, yeah, it's actually ended up, he put a lot of resources and money into it, and it was the largest farm in Lansing during that time of the 1870s. Of course, when he passed away, nobody else was doing anything with the farm, and eventually it would be sold years later by his daughter. She ended up with the property, and she ended up selling it, and then it kept getting parceled off to what you have today. So the Chandler complex up there, the Chandler Apartments, is that what it's called? Yeah, that's what it's named after. So, okay, you had a question.
Yeah, so you talked about how he had surgery on his face and
Yeah.
how he gave him a scowl.
Yes,
It sounded like he had a lot of sort of behind the scenes jobs after that.
I have. Do I still have it? No, I took it off here. Let me get back to a picture. You can see one of his pictures that he took, we known after his surgery. This one. Is there a better one?
All after that.
The next one, next one, next one. That one. Okay, you can't see it, but yeah, in fact, his skin was very thin at this point, and they would said he would be flushed a lot. And some people suggested that because he was drinking. Okay, so he always would have like a red complexion of blotches on his face. But I don't know if you can see it, but there is a scar right here on it, and his eye is still kind of like drooping at this point right here. So yeah, it gave him that fearsome expression, they said. So, which is interesting because when you think historically of Zachariah Chandler, one of the articles, most recent articles we had, you had to go all the way back actually 1994. Seemed recent to me. But it was by Maria Quinn Libby. She was a professor at Michigan State University, and I think she worked for the Michigan Historical Society too, or the Michigan Historical Center. But she had an article in 1894. I gotta go all the way back. Okay, is there? There it is. So you can hear, here's her title: Profane, Hard Drinking, Eternally Grim. Okay. Now it's funny because none of that is mentioned in her article. It's really right here. I wrote this quote: devoted to freedom, to free men, to free thought, free speech, and free exercise, Republican institution. So so this is the part that they come with this concept that he was always angry, he was always mad. And I don't know, because they described him that he would play on the floor with his grandsons and they just crawl all over him and he would wrestle with them on the floor. So like I said, he was a very extroverted person. He loved being around people and he had a sense of humor too. Yes.
That reputation, it's interesting that he and Grant had such a close historical connection. They had similar, and I would say equally unfair reputations in that sense.
Yes.
Grant probably suffered from migraine headaches, actually.
Mhm.
And some people thought that his behavior was from drinking when it wasn't, it was from that. And then had one episode evidently when he was at West Point, where he had showed up to a public event
Right.
drunk, and that reputation
It was sticking.
very much so, though, afterwards in private affairs.
And yeah, and kind of like just like today, at that time, the political parties were relentless with each other. Because let's face it, all the newspapers at the time, they were actually a political party newspaper. They're the only ones that could afford to print them out and give them to folks. So you had a very overzealous attack on their political opponents, and then they're overpraising their opponent or their political party members as well here. Actually, this is a print from a painting at this time. This is our Stephen T. Mason. And you see here, this is a political cartoon that was made. It was a political painting, I should say, and this is just a print of it. But you can see he's just bribing voters. There's drink everywhere. So yeah, the newspapers were relentless with each other at that time. So when people are doing research on Zachariah Chandler and they're hearing so many horrible things about him and about what he was doing, it was really political slander that they were using. So, hey. Yeah, getting back to this, hard drinking, eternally grim, profane. I think there may be something to his language that he used. He might have been a bit profane because in his own autobiography, they mention his great grandfather was a minister that he swore. And he said, I never said that I wasn't a sinner. And that was a quote that they put in there. So it just seems to me that they're trying to almost excuse Zachariah Chandler's nature that he actually was profane at this time. Hey, any other questions? Yes.
Is much known about them?
Right. His sister and brother-in-law that came to Detroit, they actually stayed in Detroit. His brother-in-law was buried there. He had one sister that stayed at the family farm and that was still in her house. Oh, I forget what her name was, but she was always known as Aunt something. But his Mrs. Chandler and his daughter Minnie, Mary Chandler, even though Zachariah Chandler had passed away, she was already married. She was married to a U.S. senator. When she was passing away in New Hampshire, they were at her bedside. So they were still very close with his family. He had two brothers that were just slightly older than him, but they were sickly. They ended up dying before Zachariah Chandler was elected to the United States Senate. So, hey, yes.
Is there any infrastructure or buildings or anything still in Detroit that's kind of tied to him or his days when he was there or not? Are they all gone?
Well, I don't know, because if you saw that one picture about Chandler Park, let me see if I can. Yeah, Chandler Park was named after him, but that was back in the 1920s. They did it well after. Yes, his house, I think it's pretty much the shell of his house is there. That became an office to one of the newspapers that opened up, not the Detroit Free Press. I thought it was Detroit News, and then I was doing my research, and no, it wasn't Detroit. A newspaper opened that up, and then they totally renovated the entire house and to be a newspaper office for a while. Now, his house that he had in Washington, D.C., that is very interesting because years after he died, not years, but just a few years after he died, it was purchased by the Democrat National Headquarters. So the Democrat National Headquarters was his house for years. As far as his infrastructure, what he did, we had a governor named Hazen Pingree in the 1890s, and he was pretty much doing the same thing that Zachariah Chandler had to do. He said, we need to fix our infrastructure. We need to fix our sanitation, our sewers. And he said it hadn't been done since the days of Zachariah Chandler. So 50 years it had passed by. So, okay. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
So you mentioned that his daughter had married a US senator and then was the mother of, were those Michigan senators?
No, they're from Maine. Yes. Eugene Hale was his name. And his daughter, she would have 3 boys. And only one of them actually got married and had children. He married the granddaughter to Simon Cameron, who was originally the Secretary of War, and he was a senator from Pennsylvania. The other 2, they never married. But of the other 2, one of them became a U.S. senator, and he was a bachelor all his life. Yes. And so of the great grandchildren that he had, there was only 3 siblings from there. And one of them actually fought in World War II, and he died in Italy, but he didn't have any children. And he had a daughter, a great granddaughter too. She had 1 child, and that child died when she was a teenager. And then his great grandchild, she died. So the Zachariah Chandler line has completely died out. Hey, any other questions? I've been spending 1.5 years researching Zachariah Chandler. It's like, when they ask me, what do you want to do for your presentation? Okay.